This is Lecture 72C in the ABCs of Communism series, and we're talking about Iran. This time our lectures on the transition to the Servitude Epoch and the arrival of Bolshevism. The rugged topography of western Iran, with its limited agricultural land and the practice of rain-fed agriculture, kept populations smaller and more scattered for longer than in Mesopotamia, as we saw in the last lecture. Nevertheless, the Neolithic is the foundation on which the later Iranian and Mesopotamian cultures were built. Now, the Zagros settlements date from a short time after Ossiab, which is from 10,000 to 8,800 BP. The material culture of Tapi Ganj Dera and Tapi Abdul Hussein does not include pottery, so the period is often called Aceramic or Pre-Ceramic Neolithic, and this is also true for the oldest levels of Tapi Guran located in Luristan, as well as for the sites of Ali-Kosh and Shoga Safid in the plain of Deiluran west of the Zagros Mountains. There, flocks of sheep and goats were kept for the first time. Managing animals meant a fundamentally new orientation of the Neolithic inhabitants of Iran, as we have seen, and particularly in the houses, and there would have been, of course, the incipient cultivation of cereals, as the tools for harvesting and making cereal products are there. Now, after 10,000 BP, agricultural communities such as Chogabanut, the earliest village in Susiana, started to form autochtonously in western Iran. At the same time, the earliest known clay vessels and modeled human and animal terracotta figurines were produced at Ganj Dera and Tepe Sereb in western Iran. The southwestern part of Iran was a segment of the Fertile Crescent or hilly flanks of Southwest Asia, and there some of the oldest agricultural fields have been discovered, as well as in Susa, now a city still existing since its 9,000 BP origin, and settlements such as Chogamish date to 8,800 BP, and there are the 7,000-year-old jars of wine excavated in the Zagros Mountains, and ruins of 7,000-year-old settlements at Sialk. The end of primitive communism and the transitional chiefdoms period shows that population grew in the Neolithic, as it always does when agricultural food supply increases, and it did so in Neolithic Iran as a constant supply of new villages were being built. The terminal Neolithic was characterized by the introduction of irrigation agriculture, first in the appearance of simple and then later ATC level chiefdoms. The ceramic complex reflects this with the appearance of professionally specialized pottery of the utilitarian type, and the marked reduction in the stone tool used for hunting and gathering. This is the exact same diagnostic pattern we've seen all over the world. Now, for the Copper Stone Age in Iran, the Chalcolithic, in other words, is divided into three parts. Early Chalcolithic refers to occupations falling into the 5th millennium BC. The Middle Chalcolithic includes three successive phases: early middle, and late middle Chalcolithic, dated to the 4th millennium BC, and the late Chalcolithic represents pre-Bronze Age occupations dating to the first half of the 3rd millennium BC. These archaeological periods correspond roughly to the emergence of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Now, the Uruk period existed from the early Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age, that is from 4,000 to 3,100 BC, in the Mesopotamian historic period, and this is a period of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. It follows the Ubaid period and is succeeded by the Javdit Nasser period, named after the Sumerian city of Uruk. The Uruk period saw the emergence of urban life in Mesopotamia. Sumer was the southernmost region of ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq and Kuwait, often called the cradle of civilization by Eurocentric writers. The name Sumer comes from Akkadian, the language of the north of Mesopotamia, and means land of the civilized kings. Chogamish was a very large urban settlement in western Iran of this ATC variety, which featured a typical massive platform, similar to those in Olmec, Mexico. Chogamish has a beginning occupation at 6,800 BC. In archaeological terms, it became a Chalcolithic urban settlement on the Susiana plain. However, as we have seen, people had lived there from the Neolithic up to the Proto-Literate period. It was temporarily abandoned somewhere in the early 5th millennium, around 4800 BC. It is a critical missing link filling in between primitive communism and the slave stage of the Servitude epoch. And at Chogabunut, we have another important settlement in the area that was initially discovered in 1976. It is an archaeological site in southwest Iran, located in the Khuzestan province, first built in 7200 BC. It's the oldest known lowland village in southwest Iran. From its tribal agricultural Neolithic origins, it evolved into a simple chiefdom, and then into an advanced theocratic chiefdom on the Susiana plain. As such, it played a big role in the early Elam slave stage. Later, this area became dominated by Susa. The site is especially important because it has a record from the pre-ceramic period in Iran. Now, Susa was the later nearby city that became dominant in this area. This was in the Mesopotamian late Uruk period. Susa is one of the oldest urban settlements of the region. There's a calibrated radiocarbon date of 4395 BC on the foundation of the Susa urban settlement, which at 19 acres was already very large for the time. The emergence of Susa as a city is set by radiocarbon at 4395 BC. However, it was far from alone, as there are dozens of prehistoric urban sites across the 4th millennium BC Iranian plateau. These urban centers were all of the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. Painted ceramic vessels from Susa are in their earliest style. Some urban ATCs evolved into class-divided kingdoms, with the state, that is, army and police, in the hands of the ruling classes that had emerged from the earlier ATC ruling ranks. The founding of Susa corresponds with the abandonment of nearby villages, as do the other urban ATC sites. Archaeologists have dated the first traces of an inhabited Neolithic village to 7000 BC. Evidence of painted pottery civilization has been dated to 5000 BC, and painted ceramic vessels from Susa in the earliest first style are a late regional version of the Mesopotamian Ubaid ceramic tradition that spread across the Near East during the 5th millennium BC. Pottery suggests that Susa was the re-establishment of the previously destroyed settlement at Chogamish. Chogamish, as we have seen, was also a very large urban complex with a massive platform, like the one later built at Susa. The Atc Religious Complex. Shortly after Susa was first settled over 6,000 years ago, its high ranks erected a temple on a monumental platform that rose over the flat surrounding landscape. The exceptional nature of the site is still recognizable today in the artistry of the ceramic vessels that were placed as offerings in 1,000 or more graves near the base of the temple platform. Susa's earliest settlement is known as Susa I, 4200 to 3900 BC. Two settlements named by archaeologists are Acropolis, that was 9 acres, and Apadana, which is 8 acres, that would later merge to form Susa proper, that was 23 acres. The Apadana was enclosed by 20-foot thick walls of rammed earth. This particular place is named Apadana because it also contains the late Achaemenid structure of this type. Now, nearly 2,000 pots of the Susa I style were recovered from the cemetery. Most of them are now in the Louvre. The vessels found are eloquent testimony to the artistic and technical achievement of their makers, and they hold clues about the organization of the society that commissioned them. Susa I style was a product of the past, as well as influences from then contemporary ceramic industries in the mountains of western Iran. There is a recurrence in burials of vessels of 3 types: a drinking goblet, a serving dish, and a small jar, implying the consumption of 3 types of food. Painted ceramics of these shapes are large proportions of the vessels from the cemetery. Rank differentiation in this ATC is proven by the separation of the painted better vessels from burials with coarse-looking type jars and bowls with simple bands painted on them. Professional specialists carefully made the pottery in the former burials. A Apparently, the course vessels were mass-produced and a wheel employed. The asymmetry of the vessels and the irregularity of the drawing of encircling lines and bands characterizes much of the courseware work. Copper metallurgy appears during this period, which was contemporary with metalwork at some highland Iranian sites such as Tepe-Sialk. Now at Chogabonut, we have another important settlement, the archaeological settlement in southwest Iran that's located in Khuzestan province. It has a beginning date of 7200 BC, making it the oldest village in southwestern Iran. This settlement on the Susiana plain played a big role in the early Elam area, later dominated by Susa. The site is important because it preserves a record of pre-ceramic period settlement in Iran and its subsequent evolution. Chogabonut was accidentally discovered in 1976 when the mound was being leveled for agribusiness development. Helene Cantor, then working at Chogamish nearby, hurried to the site and received a permit to investigate it. She remained for 2 seasons, the 76-77 season and 77-78 season. Abbas al-Azada continued investigations at this site in 1996, and his findings were published in 2003. We have now 5 phases of occupation at the Chogabonut site: pre-ceramic, formative ceramic, the Archeana Susiana 0 phase, dating at 5900 BC, the late middle Susiana phase 5200 BC, and the late Susiana 2 phase at 4400 to 4000 BC. And then we have the slave stage kingdoms. During the Bronze Age, the territory of present-day Iran was home to several slave stage civilizations, including Elam, Jiraf, and Zion-Darud. Successive Elamite kingdoms of the 4th millennium BC were first unified by the Iranian Medes in the 7th century BC. They reached their maximum area of control during the Achaemenid period. That empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, stretched from eastern Europe to the Indus Valley, becoming a larger empire than previously ever existed in the Western Old World. The Iranian realm fell to Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, re-emerging shortly after as the Parthian Empire. That was in turn followed by the Sasanian Empire, the Sasanian oligarchy, which became a leading world power for the next 4 centuries. Elam, the most prominent slave stage kingdom, developed in the southwest alongside those in Mesopotamia, and continued its existence until the emergence of the Iranian slave stage empires. The advent of writing in Elam was paralleled in Sumer, and the Elamite cuneiform was developed since the 3rd millennium BC. From the 34th through the 20th century BC, northwestern Iran was part of the Kura-Araxes culture, which stretched into the neighboring Caucasus and Anatolia, that is Turkey. Since the earliest 2nd millennium BC, Assyrians settled in swaths of western Iran and incorporated the region into their territories. In the AD 600s, Arab Muslims conquered the Assyrian Empire, and so the displacement of the indigenous faiths of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism with Islam. Thereafter, Iran made major contributions to the Islamic Golden Age, producing many influential leaders in art and science. After 2 centuries and various native Muslim dynasties, the area was conquered by the Turks and the Mongols. The rise of the Safavids in the AD 1400s witnessed reestablishment of a unified Iranian monarchy with conversion to the Shia variety of Islam. And by the AD 1700s, under Nader Shah, Iran was the most powerful empire in that area at that time. Now for industrial capitalism's rosy dawn. In the late 1800s, Iran's modern communist movement began when Marxism was introduced to the nation's intellectual and working classes. As everywhere where the rapid growth of industry transformed economies from the feudal halfway house to the capitalist stage, so it did so in Iran. Revolutionary social democracy in Russia and the Caucasus made northern Iran another of its centers. Meanwhile, conflict with the Russian Empire led to Iranian territorial loss. In 1901, Iran's oil industry began when British capitalist William Darcy received a concession from Iran. It was to explore for, obtain, and market oil, natural gas, asphalt, and ozocarite, a paraffin wax with industrial applications, and thereby develop southern Iran's oil resources. Darcy became founder of the oil and petrochemical industry in Persia, that is, in Iran. At this time, the Russian Empire produced the most oil in the Old World, and did so from Baku and Batum, not too far away. It was here that Stalin's proto-Bolshevik group of Social Democrats had been fighting for the rights of oil-field workers. It was only natural, in fact inevitable, that Bolshevism, as it was forming, would find its way into the southwestern Iranian oil fields as they began to get underway. Therefore, the development of modern capitalism in Iran has a two-focus orientation from its inception: the creation of an industrial proletariat around the oil and gas industry, and the entire supporting industrial infrastructure necessary on the one hand, and in agriculture on the other hand. In 1906, mass unrest in Iran culminated in the constitutional revolution that established a constitutional monarchy and the country's first legislature. The Iranian feudalists come capitalists used their state apparatus, that is, army and police, to impose capitalist relations on the rural areas by means of a land reform. Pre-capitalist features, of course, survived. Old cultivation methods, old attitudes, and old unreformed ownership patterns did not disappear, but the predominant relations were commodity ones. Accordingly, the social structure of the village became capitalist along Russian lines. Therefore, the processes of capitalism described by Lenin in the development of capitalism in Russia apply to rural Iran. First, agricultural land, its products, and the laboring capacity of the direct producers became commodities and the object of exchange. Secondly, rural areas formed a home market for industry as the market relations between these sectors grew. And thirdly, these steps resulted in a rural capitalist class structure. Commodity and market relations are essential to capitalism, and we necessarily include consideration of the production relations involved in capital accumulation. Marx makes it clear in Capital Volume 1, Part 7, that capitalism entails the expanded reproduction of production units which extract a surplus from their employment of wage labor and accumulate capital through the profitable reinvestment of that surplus. In June 1920, the Communist Party of Iran was founded in Bandar Anzali in the province of Gilan by the First Congress of Iranian Social Democrats. Haider Ogli, one of the leaders of the Constitutional Revolution of Iran, became the Secretary General of the new party. At the same time, Mirza Kuchak Khan Jangali, another leader of the Constitutional Revolution and of the Revolutionary Jangali, or Foresters Movement, established the Soviet Republic of Gilan with the assistance of Lenin's Red Army. In September 1920, the Multinational Congress of Peoples of the East was held by the Communist International in Baku, Azerbaijan. The Congress was attended by nearly 1,900 delegates from across Asia and Europe, among them revolutionaries from Iran. We have visited this Congress in depth in previous volumes. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had worked extensively in the Iranian oil field during his years as leader of the Leninist group in Baku and Batum. After the mess on the fourth day of the Congress, the Bolshevik Politburo decided against the policy of making continuing Congresses responsible for liberating the nations of the East. Instead, they gave that responsibility to the far more reliable Cheka. The Cheka's ultimate boss was Stalin, who had recommended its direct head, Felix Dzerzhinsky, for that role. It was Stalin who had advised on how to set up the Communist Party of Iran, and as head of intelligence for the Politburo, he was well placed to direct future activities of the Comintern in Iran. With the defeat of both the newly formed Soviet Republic of Gilan and the Communist Party, Communist and Social Democrat activity again went underground. In the early 1920s, the Qajar dynasty finally collapsed, and Reza Shah ascended to the throne in 1925, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty. The new Shah introduced many reforms, such as limiting the power of the Shia clergy, in turn establishing his own dictatorship. In May 1929, in Iran, 11,000 workers at the Anglo-Persian Oil Company went on strike for better pay, an 8-hour workday, annual vacations, and the right to organize a union. A 1931 strike at a textile factory in Isfahan, Iran, garnered the workers a 20% pay increase and a shift to a 9-hour workday. In 1921, a coup by the richest families brought a new government that began to protect their own Iran-based industries and provided themselves with financial incentives to start new enterprises. In 1923, a government decree compelled officials to wear only Persian-made clothes. In 1925, they passed a law exempting industrial machinery from import duties for 10 years so they could build their own factories. In 1929, Isfahan was an industrial city highly specialized in textile manufacture and its accessories. The industrial labor component encompassed 11,000 textile workers, plus those employed in modern factories manufacturing paper, matches, cigarettes, and footwear, the electric plant, and the state-owned grain silo. A quarter of the city inhabitants, about 210,000, were dependent for their livelihood on the newly established industries. In 1929 and 1930, the party organized strikes in Isfahan textile mill, the Mazandaran railways, mashed carpet workshops, and most importantly in the British-owned oil industry. The government cracked down heavily on workers, and some 200 communists were arrested, of which 38 were incarcerated in Qasr prison, QASR, in Tehran. The regime admitted 7 died there, all from natural causes. This meant the Communist Party of Iran ceased to exist for all practical purposes outside the walls of Qasr prison. In 1932, Iranian capitalists had established a large textile mill, an electric plant for generating electricity, and 5 cigarette factories. Now, about Iran's drug lords. In 1934, Reza Shah's regime was an alliance of industrial capitalists and opium capitalists. Together they passed a protectionist law which safeguarded the growth of home industries by setting high tariffs on imports of foreign merchandise and making bank loans and trade credit available to themselves as investors. Many new factories were built in the country, with Isfahan city enjoying a substantial share. So in the period 1934 to 1938, there were 11 spinning and weaving mills, 1 hosiery, 1 boot making, 2 paper, and 1 match factory, and they were established with private capital. According to a British Foreign Office document, quote, nearly every section of the population of Isfahan and its districts has invested some, if not all, of its savings, unquote. The greater part of the investment in these new ventures was derived, however, from the immense wealth accrued by the affluent opium merchants through foreign trade. Now, capitalism and agriculture in rural Iran was composed of thousands of villages that were largely self-sufficient socio-economic units. We have reviewed the growth of this system from its Neolithic origin to its servitude epic stages of slavery, feudalism, and now capitalism. The peasants produced what they required to satisfy the landowners and the kulak village bosses and their own basic needs. And if they had any surplus, it was sent to local markets. In economic terms, the landlords and kulaks marketed most of the agricultural output. After World War II, by Soviet demand, the land reform started. By 1962, it had encouraged the growth of market relations, but they were not universal in agriculture. The Agricultural Census for 1973 reveals that after the 1963 land reform, commodity relations have still penetrated only to a limited extent. Of the total number of agricultural units, 51% did not market, a significant portion of their produce. Of the rest, 27% marketed less than half of what they produced, and only 22% marketed over half. Peasants not involved in the market as sellers of their produce obviously find it difficult to participate in the commodity markets as buyers of the products of industry. On the other hand, many of those peasants who do not sell any of their agricultural produce own plots of land that are too small to support their families, and therefore must take whatever employment they can find. Unable to consume what city workers create, they had become a cheap labor underclass of rural capitalists. Farmers, large and small, purchase consumer goods and things useful in farming. In Iran, as in Russia at the time, the low level of rural income restricted such purchases. In the cities, the unequal distribution of income was exacerbated by town and country imbalance in cash flow. In 1963, the land reform policy of the White Revolution brought many important changes in economic relations to rural Iran. Before land reform, the juridical ownership of land was mainly large in scale, while actual production took place in small units. In other words, whether the land was owned by the religious institutions, the royal family, traditional landlords, or peasants, the majority of the agricultural production units were small. Approximately 83% were less than 13 acres. Tenants carried on cultivation, primarily by sharecropping and secondarily by owner cultivators. Large individual capitalist enterprises were of less importance. Landowners preferred to rent land on a crop sharing basis instead of leasing to tenants on a fixed rent basis. This predominance of sharecropping impeded the expansion of agricultural output. Why was that so? It was because the landowner would receive a large share of increase in the output. Little incentive was left for the peasants to raise their productivity. What distinguishes the tenant from the sharecropper, apart from the fixed rent paid by the farmer and the proportional rent paid by the latter, is that the tenant might himself sublet his land to sharecroppers or cultivate it with the use of wage labor. The sharecropping system covered about 2/3 of the cultivated land. It involved different types of rental payment and a variety of ways to divide the crops. With respect to the latter, the major differences concerned irrigated and non-irrigated crops. That is, how to divide the winter crops, or shatvi, from the summer crops, or seifi, and a special place for garden-grown vegetables. The landowner told his tenants what types of crops to grow. Money rent was quite common in villages close to the cities and in the villages of the Caspian littoral. However, for the most part, rent was paid in kind, and most small farmers also paid labor rent by feudal service to the landowners. While the larger farms employed wage workers, the great majority of the small peasants used unpaid family labor, only occasionally supplemented by wage labor. Wage laborers were employed mostly on a casual and seasonal basis and were paid in cash or in kind. This system was the most prevalent in northern Iran and in villages near urban areas. With the exception of some of the larger units of production, the level of agricultural output, agricultural technology and use was very low. In fact, as late as 1960, only 4% of landholdings were fully mechanized, and the irrigation system was ancient without modern technology. In 1965, Iran's Ministry of Economy input-output tables revealed that 15% of the value of total inputs for production in agriculture were purchased from industry, while industry purchased 30% of its total inputs from agriculture. The input-output tables for subsequent years indicate a dramatic shift in these figures, so that by 1972, industry's inputs to agriculture represented 46.4% of the value of total agricultural purchases, while industrial purchases from agriculture had fallen to 1.2%, and the total number of landless peasants represented 16% of the rural population. The restricted development of capitalism in rural areas also limited the employment of wage labor. the mechanized farms did not absorb a significant number of workers. Of the production units that had the potential need for labor, some remained on the old sharecropping basis, some used family labor, and some employed wage labor only at peak seasons. Traditional artisan production continued as a source of income on a reduced scale, so unable to sell their labor power, the mass of the landless population or the small owner cultivators had to continue living feudal economic lives. Some were forced to live on charity and be satisfied with a marginal way of life. In 1977, the same proportion of industrial purchases featured lower industry inputs to agriculture to about 40%. As far as agribusinesses and cooperatives are concerned, the 1973 Agricultural Census states that agricultural production units of over 86 acres constituted less than 1% of the total number of units and about 15% of the total farmland. The units between 7 and 86 hectares were 6% of the total farmland and made up 15.6% of all units, and the production units of less than 7 acres constituted 84% of all units and only 38% of all farmland. Most of the units were over 86 acres. Most of the units over 86 acres are of large-scale capitalist farms, but not all of these units were affected by land reform, and not all changed their traditional production relations. It is in these units, and in some proportion of those between 13 and 84 acres, that we find production for commodity markets and accumulation of surplus. Land reform has expanded the number of individual large-scale farm operations, created large farm corporations, and established agribusinesses. These large units enjoyed the full support of the government for expensive infrastructural investments in roads and modern irrigation systems, tax credits, subsidies, and extensive low-interest credit from the Agricultural Development Bank. However, these big capitalist units made up a very small percentage of the total number of farms. The largest units, the agribusinesses, that received the benefits of vast sums of government expenditures, did not represent a significant percentage of total agricultural output, land, or wage labor. After the fall of the Shah's dictatorship, many of these large farms were taken over by their cultivators, divided into small plots. Now, capitalist relations exist among the farmers of units over 64 acres. It's unclear to what extent they do in smaller units, such as those in the range of 13 and 86 acres. The average size of the unit in this uncertain category is approximately 26 acres, but size alone cannot give a precise indication of the potential output of a farm without knowledge of the availability of water and other factors of production. Many peasant farms of more than 13 acres find that, like the majority with less than 13 acres, they are unable to accumulate a yearly surplus and remain, therefore, at a subsistence level. The problem of Iranian agriculture, especially acute for the production units with less than 13 acres, which represents the majority of the rural population, have been aggravated by government policies. The state, that is the government that created the many small owner cultivators, at the same time erected many barriers to their viable operation, denying them the possibility of capital accumulation. State irrigation policy concentrated on the needs of the large-scale units and virtually ignored the desperate need of the smaller ones. Water availability is an old problem in Iranian agriculture. The cooperative societies that were charged with the responsibility of supervising and maintaining the traditional Qanat irrigation system of underground water channels did not fulfill their obligations, and it was allowed to decay. Nevertheless, Bani Sadr made major expenditures toward the repair of the Qanat system. Inhibiting the efficient use of land was the parcelization created by the land reform. This varied from one region to another. In Iraq, of the total households of who received land, 97% averaged 16 fragmented plots of land. In Bandar Abbas, of the total number of households that got land, 80% averaged 4 fragmented plots. Therefore, the credit needs of the small units were not satisfied by the rural cooperatives set up by the government. Consequently, small peasants were forced to turn to village usurers or moneylenders, who became a powerful group after the land reform. The little credit that the small producers could obtain was spent mainly on their immediate consumption needs or to repay old debts, and therefore did not go for the purchase of agricultural inputs from industry. Parcelization and lack of credit inhibited the mechanization of the small units. The government policy of providing urban areas with cheap, staple foods for reasons of political stability meant price controls for many agricultural products. Increased demand for food products in urban areas was met by subsidized, higher-priced imports rather than increased domestic production, which would have benefited the rural areas. The land reform left a large portion of the rural population without land. This rural mass was in competition for the same employment with those peasants who received insufficient land for their subsistence. And that brings us close to the end of this development of capitalism in Iran. And in the next lecture, we're going to see how the Communist Party organized the opposition to capitalism in Iran, and how the Islamic Revolution of 1979 finally occurred. Make some comments about that.